It's taken.
Okay, welcome. That was fun. Thank you for coming to the briefing on the Americans with Disabilities Act and the ADA's community integration mandate. I am Jennifer Mathis from the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, one of the co-chairs of the CCD Rights Task Force. CCD stands for the Consortium of Citizens with Disabilities, and the Consortium of Citizens with Disabilities is a coalition of over 100 national disability organizations representing people with disabilities, family members, advocates, service providers, state officials, and others, all working together to advance the rights of people with disabilities. And CCD Rights Task Force is hosting this briefing. It is part of a series of briefings on the ADA and disability rights that we will be having. This one is about primarily the community integration mandate, and that we will have one in September. I think other parts of CCD will have one in September on education and disability, in October on accessible technology and disability, and in November on veterans with disabilities. So in any event, this is the first one. This is the kickoff. I just should explain a little bit by way of background. The reason we decided to do these briefings is that over the past year or two, members of CCD had gotten many questions from Hill staff about some of the basics of the ADA in conjunction with some pieces of legislation that you all were considering. And it seemed to us at some point that since so much time had gone by since 1990 when the ADA was passed, and they're not as fresh in people's minds as it used to be, and there were so many questions, that we would take the opportunity to be a little proactive and create some forums where we could offer you some information about some of the fundamental issues under the ADA and other disability rights laws. And so this first briefing, as I said, it's got two parts to it because it is the kickoff of the series of briefings. We're starting with one panel, which is really sort of our ADA basics panel, sort of the history of the ADA, purpose and the vision, how we got there, why this law is so important. And so the first panel is going to be Kai Feldblum and Arlene Mayerson. Heather Ansley from Vets First is going to introduce that panel, but I just want to give you the overall structure. The second panel is going to be about the community integration, the integration mandate of the ADA itself. And that panel will have Clyde Terry from the National Council on Disability, Beatrice Bacon, a DC former nursing home resident who now lives in her own home, Eve Hill, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the Justice Department, Ira Burnham, the Legal Director at the Bazelon Center, and Sam Bagenstos, Professor of Law and former Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. It's a mouthful. Anyway, so having given you the structure, I will turn it over to Heather to introduce the first panel. I just want to say, though, that this is a really phenomenal set of speakers with really tremendous knowledge, both about the ADA and the integration mandate, people who have been there since the beginning, people who have helped shape and develop the law for the last 20 plus years. So we had a briefing this morning on the House side, and I think everybody found it incredibly useful. And you're in for, I think, a really good time.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. As Jennifer said, my name is Heather Ansley, and I'm the Vice President of Vets First. Vets First is a program of United Spinal Association, and we represent the culmination of over 65 years of service to disabled veterans and their families, and the rights of people with all people with disabilities, including veterans who have disabilities, has been a critical focus of our organization throughout the years. and a reason why we have cared and continue to care about the Americans with Disabilities Act. As was mentioned, our first panel today is going to discuss the history, purpose, and vision of the ADA. By way of background, it was signed into law on July 26, 1990 by President George H.W. Bush. The ADA prohibits discrimination and guarantees that people with disabilities will have the same opportunities as all Americans, that really focus on the ability to have access to employment, living in the community, access to services, buildings, transportation, all of the things that someone needs to be able to truly be a part of their community. And we are very fortunate today to have two very distinguished panelists who are going to walk us through that mission and vision, who played key roles in the development and passage not only of the ADA but also the subsequent ADA Amendments Acts of 2008. So I'll now introduce our distinguished panelists. First, on my right here. Got it right this time. First, Arlene Mayerson has been the directing attorney of the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, or DREDA, since 1981. She's one of the nation's leading experts in disability rights law and has been an advisor to both Congress and the disability community for over 3 decades. Has worked on major legislation, including the Handicapped Children's Protection Act, as well as other legislation ensuring that special education rights of students who have disabilities, as well as the ADA and the ADA Amendments Act. She's devoted her career exclusively to working on disability rights issues. She was appointed by the Secretary of Education to the Civil Rights Reviewing Authority and was responsible for reviewing civil rights decisions of the department. She holds a faculty appointment in disability law at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and serves on the advisory committee of the Impact Fund. She has published many articles on disability and is the author of a comprehensive 3-volume treatise on the ADA, which sets forth the legislative history and regulations for each provision of the law. She received her LLM from Georgetown University and her JD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Next, on her right, we have Hy Feldblum, who serves as a commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. She was nominated by President Obama. Prior to her tenure at the EEOC, she was a professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, where she taught since 1991. She founded the Law Center's Federal Legislation and Administrative Clinic and represented clients such as the U.S. Catholic Charities USA, the National Disability Rights Network, and the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. When she was legislative counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union, she played a leading role in helping to draft the Americans with Disabilities Act, and later as a law professor representing the Epilepsy Foundation, was equally instrumental in helping to negotiate the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. She received her JD from the Harvard Law School. So we have, you're in for a very robust review of the ADA, and we thank them for coming today. So first we're going to start with Arlene.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about the history of the ADA. It's important to remember why it was necessary and how it was passed. I'm afraid that today this history is lost, and the ADA is too often perceived as a bunch of random regulations falling from the sky unannounced, like the tax code. Please forgive me in advance if I don't mention someone's name that you might know to be pivotal in the ADA, because I can't possibly mention everyone's name. Given this current state of affairs, the story of the ADA may seem to some like a fairy tale. The people were heard. The Democratic members worked hand in hand with the Republican members. The Republican administration worked with the Democratic House and Senate, and a new world was created for people with disabilities in the United States. And this nation's moral authority spread throughout the world, setting a standard of access for people with disabilities. So, how did this happen and why did it happen? First and foremost, disability is an open minority, and Hy, in the earlier briefing, has a few words to say about my use of the word minority. Maybe it isn't anymore. There are no party, race, religion, ethnic criteria for joining this minority. And although the disability itself may involve mobility, sight, hearing, learning, people with disabilities share a common experience of exclusion, degradation, and discrimination. There are few that have not had the experience themselves or with a family member or a friend of watching this type of humiliation. And you can't help but cringe at the thought of someone being treated as though they are not an equal human being. There is no greater testament to the bipartisan nature of disability than the story of the ADA. As many of you may know, the original draft of the ADA was presented by the National Council on Disability, an entity that was created by two Republicans, Senator Weicker and Congressman Bartlett, chaired and directed by Republican disability rights leaders Sandy Perino and Lex Frieden, and comprised of a 15-member board of Reagan appointees. It was this esteemed Republican body that brought to us the most comprehensive law on the rights of people with disabilities ever to be seen in the world. And it was President H.W. Bush who made the commitment to see it enacted into law. And his counsel, Boyd & Gray, his Attorney General, Dick Thornburgh, and his EEOC, and a member of the EEOC that he had appointed, Evan Kemp, fought hard for its passage. Boyd & Gray explained to his Republican colleagues that the ADA was about empowerment, that it was actually a piece of welfare reform legislation. Senators Hatch and Congressman Fish played key roles in breaking deadlocks, and many other Republican senators, like Senator McCain and Dole, were stalwart supporters. To our Democratic champions, Senator Kennedy and Harkin, Congressman Coelho, Hoyer, Mineta, and Miller, the ADA was a natural progression in a proud history of civil rights. It was for this reason, this history of civil rights, that we were also able to get the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights to make it its #1 priority in the civil rights arena, the ADA, rights of people with disabilities, and that was historic as well. Our advocates on the Hill were also a mixed bunch, including Pat Wright, a self-proclaimed hippie from Berkeley, and Justin Dart, coming from a highly privileged and influential Republican family. Whether called empowerment or called civil rights, eradicating the unfair and unjustified degradation of disabled citizens was the heart of the ADA. As Justice Marshall stated in Cleburne in 1985, this is a case involving a town saying that they didn't want any group home with people with intellectual disabilities to live in their community. And at the time, you'll excuse Justice Marshall's language, as he says, mentally retarded throughout. Quote, "The mentally retarded have been subject to a lengthy and tragic history of segregation and discrimination that can only be called grotesque. A regime of state-mandated segregation and degradation emerged that in its virulence and bigotry rivaled and indeed paralleled the worst excesses of Jim Crow. Massive custodial institutions were built to warehouse the retarded for life. The aim was to halt reproduction of the retarded and nearly extinguish their race. Retarded children were categorically excluded from public schools based on the false stereotype that all were ineducable and on the purported need to protect the non-retarded student from them." And these famous lines, "Prejudice, once let loose, is not easily cabined. The lengthy and continuing isolation of the retarded has perpetuated the ignorance, irrational fears, and stereotyping that has long plagued them." These are very dramatic words, and in fact, the words could be applied to people with a variety of disabilities. Being segregated from society creates stereotypes. And whether you're segregated because you're in an institution, or because you can't get on the bus, or you can't leave your home, or you can't get down a curb, or you can't have any alternative communication, if you're blind or deaf, if you have discriminatory policies, medical policies, that you can't have a job because you have diabetes, whatever the reason, the result is exclusion and the result is segregation, and the linchpin for the remedy is integration. In case anyone thought this was ancient history, and when we were working on the ADA, every single hearing had people with a variety of disabilities talking about their own experiences. And I'm just going to give you a few of those examples. First of all, the kickoff hearings always had the members themselves talking about their own experience or their family's experience with disability. So Senator Harkin talked about his brother, who was deaf, who was offered the opportunity to be a candlestick maker or a baker. Senator Kennedy talked about his son who lost a leg to cancer and his sister who had mental retardation. And Representative Coelho, a key author of the ADA, talked about how he discovered he had epilepsy in college and it nearly destroyed his life. Not because he had changed. He says, I hadn't changed. The world around me had changed. And all of my opportunities had changed. The members heard from a young woman with cerebral palsy who used an electric wheelchair and went down to her local theater to see a movie. And people would help her with a very, very heavy door. And at one point, the theater owner told her, I really don't want you here. I don't want you to bother my patrons. And she came home very upset. And her mother called the theater and said, well, that sounds like discrimination. And the person that owned the theater said, I don't really care what it sounds like. And this was repeated often during the process of the ADA to say, theater owner, we care what it sounds like. And we don't want to tolerate that kind of behavior. A Vietnam vet came back from Vietnam after having served his country. And he used a wheelchair. And he came back to find out that he couldn't get on the bus. He couldn't get out of his housing project. He can't get down the curb. And he couldn't find a job because of discrimination. And he told the members, I guess I fought for everyone but myself. And now I'm going to fight for the ADA. A woman testified about losing her breast to cancer and how at the same time she lost her job and couldn't find another one because no one would hire someone who had a history of cancer. Parents of a small child who had died of AIDS came in to testify that when their child died, they couldn't find any undertaker who would bury their child because of fear of the child and AIDS. These stories went on, and as I said, I'm just telling you a few of them. And it involved every possible disability and every possible aspect of American life. And those stories didn't end in the hearing rooms. People from around the country flocked to Washington. The idea that there was going to possibly be a national civil rights law for people with disabilities attracted people from all over the country who came to say to their members, you must do this, it's the right thing to do. So these efforts paid off. And what we had was a remarkable vote in the Senate of 91-6. And in the House, 377-28. Celebrations erupted immediately. People with all kinds of disabilities, the traditional civil rights community, and Republican and Democratic lawmakers rejoiced together. So for the first time in history, people with disabilities were granted the same rights to citizenship as others take for granted. And if it means anything, the ADA means that, the ADA means that people with disabilities are no longer out of sight and out of mind. It's very easy to feel good about your policies and your practices and your architecture and your communication if you don't see anyone being excluded, because people with disabilities just simply aren't there. And this has been, I think, the biggest change in American life, is that people with disabilities are in your communities, and shopping in the stores, and going to the theaters, taking the buses, going to college. The ADA is not perfect, and it's not self-executing. And there's been much exposure to its failures, but it is impossible to overstate the degree to which it has changed the landscape of America and the lives of individuals with disabilities. Ask anyone who uses a wheelchair if the ADA has made a difference in their life, and you will hear yes. As my friends and colleagues who use wheelchairs tell me, never ever underestimate the ability to use a public restroom. To get on the bus. Ask a person who is deaf what it means to have a relay system where they can call anyone in the country and communicate. Ask any school child, employer, owner of a public accommodation if they are now aware that people with disabilities live in their communities. And the answers will certainly be more yeses than it was before the ADA was enacted. And there's a growing recognition of disability as a legitimate area of study in the academies. And with this new intellectual environment, we elevate the issues that were at best marginal before the ADA. Disability is part of our national conversation. So again, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share with you what I really think is an example of the best of American democracy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back in this room where so many good things have happened, and I hope a lot of additional good things will be happening as you get energized from not just hearing some of the history from this first panel, but really hearing some of the work that's being done to implement the integration mandate of the ADA under Olmstead that you will hear about in the second panel. But in terms of the looking back, setting the framework for the work ahead, the point about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was in fact to break down the barriers between us and them. Break down the concept that there were those people with disabilities and somehow all the rest of us. One of the most important documents that was used by those of us who worked on the ADA was a report called Accommodating the Spectrum that Bob Bergdorf and Christopher Bell had worked on, which is noting that we're all on the spectrum of disability. And so when I heard this morning Arlene note that disability is an open minority, I completely agree. It is so important to recognize that disability can cut across race, class, sex, sexual orientation, religion, age, right? But I wasn't quite sure about the word minority in terms of numbers, because the way that many of us think about disability, the way certainly that the Americans with Disabilities Act was initially envisioned, although the judges couldn't quite get their heads around it, but the way it was originally envisioned and the way the ADA Amendments Act of 2008 then revitalized it, was to stress the fact that all of us have impairments, physical and mental impairments, that can simply be the cause of discrimination, that someone decides they want to discriminate against you because of that impairment, and that is then covered under the third prong of the definition of disability of the ADA, or have an impairment that actually substantially limits some bodily function or some life activity. But people don't necessarily think of it as disability. So, for example, you don't know that I have a disability unless I tell you I have a psychiatric disability. Right? I have to come out as a person with anxiety disorder that's medicated. Right? Same way that you don't know I'm a lesbian unless I come out and tell you I'm a lesbian. You might be having a job, someone has heart disease, you don't know the person has heart disease. Someone has epilepsy or diabetes, you don't know that they have that. When they might need an accommodation, then they might come out, and then you know that they're a person with a disability. As opposed to, you know that Beatrice Bacon uses a wheelchair. You'll see that Clyde Terry is blind. Okay? Those are things you can see. But from the concept of the ADA, both as we worked on it in 1990 and then as Congress reaffirmed in 2008, there's not a difference between those individuals in terms of access to civil rights. There is no difference. We all deserve to be integrated into society. We all deserve to be expected to hold a job. Expected to hold a job. I still remember Jason O, who uses a wheelchair, started just 3 years ago, maybe, the group of federal employees with disabilities. He came to talk to me and he said, part of the issue here is expectations. Because I was pumping gas, right? And this guy saw me and he says, "Good job." Good job. I mean, I'm a lawyer, I've got this top position, but I know when I go in to apply for a job, they're thinking, oh, it's probably a good job if you can pump gas. That's absurd. You have to be raising the level of expectation for everybody. Now, although the ADA and the ADA Amendments Act wanted to cut down this distinction between us and them, we all recognize that there are differences in terms of social norms and expectations along those lines of impairments. And that, in fact, certain people with certain disabilities have even greater stigma, and certain people with certain disabilities that might need additional supports to live independently and be integrated need those additional supports. But it's all along the spectrum. The idea of the ADA was to say that all of us are part of society. That equality doesn't mean treating people equally the same, because we're not all the same to begin with. To say, oh, we're going to treat everyone the same, everyone will come into this building. I mean, the building has steps, but everyone gets to come in on the same entrance. Yeah, but if you're using a wheelchair, that's not going to give you access. Equality under the ADA means treating people as equals, with equal dignity and respect. And that is often very difficult when you have a presumption in your mind of what someone is capable of. Part of breaking down between the us and the them is lots of people don't think that just because they have heart disease doesn't mean they can't have a job. People don't think because they have had cancer that they can't have a job. So why is it that we think that someone further along in terms of an impairment suddenly can't have a job? We are at a moment in time, I believe, one of those stepping moments, one of those turning points in social movements. Because of the work on education law that people like Oline and others here have worked on, young people with disabilities are coming through the educational system thinking that they can and should work. The question is, what is the rest of society going to be doing as those young adults are now looking to come into the community? Our responsibility as policymakers, as advocates, as human beings is to make sure that people are treated as equals, with equal dignity and respect. That was the goal of the ADA Amendments Act of 2008, And I look forward, and I know you will, to hearing some of the amazing things you will hear from the second panel about pushing the envelope to make sure that we are all integrated. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene and Hannah. That was a wonderful rendition of what's happened with the ADA and really helped set the stage for where we're going to be looking in the next panel. We do have some time for some questions or comments that people may have. We do not have a mic to Rove, unfortunately, so we will repeat the question. I will repeat it to make sure that everyone can hear the question, and then we'll have the answer. So if you have a question, please signify somehow to me. In the back, Esme Graham.
Thank you so much. I think that it's wonderful to hear the history and to see both the important history of the ADA. And also you're a great supporter of the conventional rights of persons with disabilities. So a lot of what we're hearing is how can our lessons, what we've learned in the past 23 years, really lend experience to countries who have no disability rights legislation whatsoever. So I'm curious what your take on is on how the ratification of the Conventional Rights of Persons with Disabilities can really impact other countries abroad as well as Americans with disabilities.
So the question, just so everyone heard, relates to how what our country has worked with the Americans with Disabilities Act and the tremendous impact that has had, how that can move forward into the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and broadening it to the world service.
So last in the House, I took that question, but I think, is Rhonda here? Do you want to answer the question? Okay. She's our person on the ground on the CRPD. CRPD is a document that was passed by the UN, which really takes the model of the ADA and endorses the ideas that we've been talking about dignity and equality and respect and access. And it's divided into sections, just like the ADA has public accommodations and employment, and really trying to cover all the aspects of life, of civic life, for people around the world. And at this point, I think it's 133 countries have ratified the convention. It was introduced in our Senate, and during the lame duck session, it lost by 5 votes. And there are all the people that have been working on the CRPD in the disability community, and again, another bipartisan effort among the community, hope to bring it again to the Senate in September. And why is it important? It's important because, as I said, the ADA is one of our finest examples of American democracy, what our values are, the humanity that we have towards all people, having dignity and respect. And we want to stand for that. And we want to say, you know, we're proud of this document that was based on our law. This thing that we started in 1990 is our emblem. And we need to stand behind that and hope that the rest of the world follows our example. We want to be the leader on this. We don't want to reject what we started. And it gives us the moral authority, the technical authority to go around the world and bring the kind of access, whether it's our citizens that are going to be in these various countries or the citizens of the countries themselves, to bring that same kind of dignity and respect to the world at large.
So I'll just add one thing. The commission, the 5-member commission, sent a letter up to the Senate the last go around to explain that if the Senate ratified CRPD, there would be no changes that the EOC would need to make in any regulations, etc., because it, as you heard from Arlene, it just really mirrored the same employment non-discrimination law. But what I heard from businesses at the time was that part of why a number of them wanted to see the U.S. ratify the treaty was because there is organization that sits and hears from countries that are trying to figure out, those countries who actually do have to pass new laws now to come into compliance with the treaty, whether what they're doing is in fact in compliance. And you can't be at that table unless you have yourself ratified the treaty, you as a country. So for businesses that would like to see uniformity across all the countries in terms of employment, access, etc., they would rather be able to have the U.S. be at the table so that in fact there's not a whole set of different ways of implementing that same treaty. So I think there's not only reinforcing what Arlene said, certainly a strong moral imperative to own something that we in fact helped start, but also just as a purely practical matter to ensure that uniformity.
And just to add to what I said, thanks for adding that, is that as it went to the EOC, it went to every agency of the federal government. And it says over and over and over again, we're not making new law in the United States, it's not enforceable in our courts, we're not changing anything. There's been a lot of rumors about what this treaty does. And I think that anyone who actually has the time to look at it and read it will know it doesn't do those things. But if there's anyone here who has a member who has questions about it, we're more than happy to answer those questions.
Thank you. Do we have another question or comment from anyone? In the back, please.
Hi. First of all, I think it's great hearing all about the issue of the ADA and how much it's helped people with all disabilities. But a lot of the criticism against the passage of the ADA came from businesses, and like 5 years, 10 years out, they released those surveys came about how because of the ADA, unemployment went up for men specifically that had mental or physical disabilities. Can you talk about why maybe that was the case, and if the situation has improved at all today for the unemployment rate for specifically male with disabilities?
So the question relates to the impact on the ADA on employment for people with disabilities and what the outlook has been on that. I don't know who would like to take that.
No, but I thought, didn't you say, I'm sorry, because I couldn't totally hear it,
Yeah,
but speaking about mental disabilities and
the impact that the ADA, passage of the ADA has had on people with disabilities and employment, including men who have mental health.
Yeah, so it is interesting sometimes how people collect statistics.
Yeah.
So the stated, as you described it, that businesses said that 5 to 10 years after passage of the ADA, the unemployment rate of, you were saying specifically, men with mental disabilities went up. I would strongly contest the accuracy of those statistics, but here's what I think is relevant. One, businesses actually worked with us to help craft the original ADA, and there were various compromises that we made in order to accommodate some of the business needs. And we did that again in ADA Amendments Act of 2008. But any of us who has worked in the disability rights movement, we're not happy with the rate of employment for people with disabilities. We are not happy. Now, no one ever expected that the ADA on its own would suddenly get rid of people's prejudices and assumptions. But we were hopeful that the ADA would in fact bring more people with disabilities into the workforce, and that getting to know people with disabilities would then dissipate some of the stereotypes. Instead, what happened is the courts went off on this route of holding that people were not people with disabilities. And so you essentially had 15 years of not really having the ADA do what it potentially could do. And I think we are now at a point where we've got, hopefully, the coverage of disability established. And a lot of what the EOC is doing now is trying to get out there with education and with litigation to make sure that people understand their obligations to accommodate, their obligations not to discriminate. And I hope as we start collecting better statistics on employment of people with disabilities, we'll see if there is an impact. But beyond that, there are things that the ADA on its own cannot do. And that is like, this is the next stage. This is the unfinished business of types of employment. Really changing the employment picture also means having supported employment, having customized employment. It's different things that are beyond what the ADA perhaps would require. So I don't think we can really know good statistics until we start collecting those statistics. And I will say I'm very proud that the EOC issued in February 2012 its proposed new applicant flow form. For years, the federal government has collected data on race, ethnicity, and gender in terms of applicants in order to then compare against, okay, how many of this race, ethnicity, gender are we hiring? For the first time, we will be collecting data on disability. Right, so we issued that proposed new applicant flow form in February 2012. I am very much hoping that within the next month that will be published for its final form. And then I think we can really start educating people about the spectrum of disability and also start putting clear expectations of what we want to see in terms of hiring.
We have one more question or comment for this panel.
Actually, I'm thrilled to forego and have you hear this second panel, which is totally, can I say it here? Ass panel.
So let's thank our panel one again. And we will now change out and have panel two come up.